Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I am delighted to talk to Hassam Munir. You are most welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Hassam is an Islamic history researcher currently pursuing an MA in history at the University of Toronto, where he is at the moment. He focuses on multimedia public history work. He was recognized as an emerging historian at the 2017 Heritage Toronto Awards. He is the founder of the iHistory blog and a research fellow at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. Hassam has written a fascinating article entitled "Did Islam Spread by the Sword? A Critical Look at Forced Conversions," which is here printed off my own copy, which I will link to in the description below. It's really worth reading. It's actually not that long either. Hassam, could you kindly introduce us to the historical and theological issues you raise in your article?
Yes, definitely. I'd like to begin actually with a story just to set sort of the conversation in motion. And this story particularly came to my attention because it has to do with the city of Christchurch, New Zealand, which, as we know, was the site of a very tragic incident 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, in which 49 Muslim worshippers were killed essentially by an assailant in some of the mosques in that city. So the story goes with these two individuals, a father and son duo. So the father's name is Sultan and the son's name is Saleh, and they are from the Turkmenistan region, and they are Muslims. And they migrate in the 1890s to New Zealand. And in the very early years of the 20th century, they settle in the city of Christchurch. And the father passes away not too long thereafter, but the son, Saleh, he settles in the city and is able to set up his own business and build a life for himself as an ice cream seller. So, producing ice cream was something that this family had a particular interest in and a talent for, clearly, because they were very, very successful. Their ice cream became very popular. And because many of the locals were not able to pronounce the name of Saleh, or were not familiar with it, they started to call him Charlie. So he became known in the city of Christchurch as Ice Cream Charlie. And interestingly enough, this brand still exists today. So if you go to Christchurch, you can actually still get Ice Cream Charlie ice cream from the descendants of Ice Cream Charlie. And he married locally to a local woman of New Zealand. And, they had many children and raised a family. And he was very, very well known and loved. He would sell ice cream sort of in the main squares, etc., of the city. And I'm thinking about that in relation to the Christchurch assailant, because this is a story that individual, almost certainly did not know. And when you read his manifesto, and I just like to quote from it, but for the purposes of just, having intellectual conversation, he does cite as one of his sort of motivations the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, which was waged by the Ottoman Empire, right? And the point I'm trying to draw attention to there is that this person who was from Australia and went to New Zealand to carry out these premeditated attacks on innocent people, Muslims, in the city of Christchurch, New Zealand, was not aware of this particular history of Muslims within that very space in which he was carrying out those actions, a history in which, a Muslim was establishing himself within this society through, intermarriage, through trade, and through migration, and through his social influence, right? So that is essentially an example of Islam spreading to Christchurch, New Zealand, but the assailant had nothing to do with any of that information or that history. He was fixated on the Battle of Kosovo in a faraway place in the Balkans from the year 1389. So this is something that, a story I like to tell in terms of how historical narratives and fixating on certain aspects of history can be very, very misleading, dangerously misleading. Right. In this case, it was dangerously misleading. He himself cites that battle as his motivation and doesn't know anything else much about Islamic history, apparently, and certainly not the history of Muslims and how it has spread to different regions of the world. So I like to start off with that story, and now we can kind of get back into the narrative. And I think as we go along, the benefit of understanding local history and looking at the spread of Islam to different places as a very complex kind of story will become more apparent. And I often tell people, if you ask someone, how was your day? Chances are they'll give you, after, the initial, it was great or it was not so great. But if you probe them a little bit, they can give you all kinds of details about the decisions that they made and what motivated those decisions and things like that. But if you ask someone, how did Islam spread? It's sad that they feel very comfortable saying Islam spread by the sword, right? So a single individual's story of one day in their life and the decisions they made is so complex that it might take you 10, 15 minutes to listen to them, to go through everything that happened. But when you talk about over 14 centuries of history and all of the people involved and all of the thinking involved in their decision or the process of them converting to Islam, how do we feel comfortable taking a complex historical topic and just summing it up in 5 words, right? So this is just something that is sort of against sort of, the intellectualism of the human being, that this is not something that is very accurate. It's not a very meaningful way to describe history. And it's something that is almost designed to be weaponized in certain ways, right? So when we talk about all of the things we enjoy or, like about what happened in Islamic history, and when we talk about all the things we don't like that happened in Islamic history, we shouldn't just settle for these very surface level slogans of sorts that summarize these vast processes in just a few words. We should dig a bit deeper than that, scratch the surface just a little bit, and learn to appreciate that just like our lives are so complex, and everyone would like their complexity of their own lives to be appreciated by others. Similarly, when we look at past figures, we should look at the complexity and the context in which they were operating and sort of appreciate that, even if we may vehemently disagree with it or we may agree with it. So that's sort of like just a preamble that I wanted to get across, and hopefully it's helpful.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So this particular Islam spread by the sword narrative has been around since the Crusades. So the first sort of iteration of this that sounds very much like what you might find on Twitter today, for example, Islam spread by the sword, goes back to an individual named Peter the Venerable many centuries ago. And he was sort of describing Islam and the Muslims in this particular way. And the concept of forced conversions in Islamic history is one aspect of this overall narrative. So this is more like a galaxy of topics, and the gist of all of it is that Muslims are extraordinarily violent, prone to, barbaric behavior that sort of offends the shared morality of all humans, as well as that all of this is actually not just incidental, it's inspired by their faith, right? It's actually inspired by their scriptures and things along those lines. So this is sort of the overall message. And, particularly in a context in which Islam has been, associated with terrorism by disingenuous sort of voices in the times in which we have lived, this provides a sort of helpful history, right? This is very convenient to take the present kind of description or narrative that you have about Muslims and, deprive that of the context of modern politics and, everything that has happened, and instead push it back into history and say they have always been like this. Islam has always been spread by the sword. They are all on this core mission to force others to convert to Islam, to subjugate the rest of the world, etc., etc. Right? So it has been very convenient, especially in recent times, but it's not a recent argument. It has existed for a long time, and it's also not an isolated argument, which is why it's difficult to cover all components and all interconnected aspects of it in one podcast or in one article. So in the article that you referenced for Yaqeen Institute, will there be gaps? Will there be aspects that are not adequately addressed? Absolutely. And I'm the first to acknowledge that. And it's just a starting point. It's just food for thought, essentially, to challenge some of these dominant sort of narratives. So going back originally to the text, right? Let's talk about the theological sort of position. What does the Quran say about forced conversion and spreading Islam? It's very, very clear. And interestingly, it's also positioned, the verse of the Quran that relates most clearly to this is well positioned because it comes right after, immediately after what is known as the verse of the throne, right? Which is a very famous sort of verse that Muslims memorize and Muslims recite and are very familiar with. And the immediate next verse is this. Which the meaning of which translates to, let there be no compulsion in religion, for the truth stands out clearly from falsehood, right? And to put it in the words of the famous commentator on the Quran, known as Ibn Kathir, he said that this passage means, and I quote, "Do not force anyone to become Muslim, for Islam is plain and clear, and its proofs and evidence are plain and clear. Therefore, there is no need to force anyone to embrace Islam," right? So Islam essentially is seen as something that needs to be embraced by the heart, even among those of us who were born into Muslim families and Muslim cultures and raised as Muslims. We are constantly encouraged, both within the culture of those communities as well as within the Quran itself, to reflect, to ponder, to basically rediscover our relationship with this Islamic worldview when we reach past a certain age of maturity within our lifetimes, and then constantly engage until our lives end, right? And so to force others to embrace Islam would, almost be defeating the purpose for why, you want them to be Muslim. So it's a contradiction in that sense, which is what Ibn Kathir is alluding to.
So can I just mention briefly, because
sure.
that some people sometimes say, oh, well, verses like this were revealed in Mecca when the Prophet wasn't powerful, but when he went to Medina, it was all very different. But actually, the fact is that this verse you just quoted, Surah 2, verse 256, is from Medina. It's from the latter stage of his life when he was, in a sense, a head of state, had political power, and that was taught or revealed then at that stage, not in the earlier stage when he was, so to speak, powerless in Mecca. So it's really important that even the timing of this suggests when he had the power to enforce, the teaching was still, let there be no compulsion in religion.
Absolutely, right. So I appreciate you pointing that out. Because that is important context when particular verses were revealed. But yes, it would, essentially, again, forcing someone to convert to Islam defeats the purpose for why you want them to be Muslim or why they need to be Muslim, right? So even among Muslims, like I mentioned, we are on faith journeys in which we constantly try to re-engage and strengthen our relationship with faith. And that's something that is encouraged, right? That is a separate conversation, perhaps for another time. But essentially then, how does the Quran instruct Muslims to convey the message of the faith? This is outlined in 16:125 of the Quran. So, Surah 16 and verse 125, in which it says very clearly, invite all to the way of your Lord with wisdom and kind advice, and only debate with them in the best manner, right? So this is supposed to be an intellectual journey. This is supposed to be an emotional, a spiritual journey in which an individual reflects on the realities of their life around them. And also, it's just part of the lived experience. So there may often be other motivations, right? That sort of drive a person towards Islam, makes them, consider Islam more seriously, etc. So, we see these situations in everyday life, such as for the purpose of marriage, right? And intermarriage has been sort of an important driving factor in conversion to Islam in certain places. But that being said, again, regardless of where you are in your journey, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, the Islamic worldview is constantly encouraging you to engage with the message and to connect it to your own lived experiences, and see if it makes sense, right? And it will make sense. It will help you understand that this is the best way of life, and of course for success in the afterlife as well. That being said, that is sort of the theological sort of basis there. It's important to keep in mind, however, that when we talk about the spread of Islam and when we talk about the spread of the Muslim empire, we are talking about two different things, right? And this is, I think, where a lot of the confusion comes from. So if I go to YouTube and I search spread of Islam, I will find these interesting animations, etc., that will, they're going chronologically through history. And then you get to the 6th century and there is this small sort of blip on the map in Arabia, in the Hijaz region. It might be green or something like that. And then as the chronological sort of movement, continues, all you see is this green little dot just spreads very, very quickly all over the place, right? In every direction. And that is the spread of the Muslim empire historically. So when we do say, just within several decades of the passing of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Muslim empire stretched from Spain to India. That is true, right? That is different from the spread of Islam. And we can talk about that, in more detail. But one of the key aspects of that is that Muslims remained a minority within those regions, and not just like a close minority, but a minority in that the significant majority of people within those regions continued to be non-Muslims for at least 2 centuries in almost every region that we can speak about. And this has been sort of studied empirically based on the resources available by Richard Bulliet and others. And so, there's an interesting quote by Hugh Kennedy, who has done a lot of research and writing about the early Muslim conquest, in which he says, Islam did not spread by the sword, but without the sword, it could not have spread, right? And that's very interesting. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly clear my throat. Apologies for that. And that's very interesting because it's important to acknowledge that Islam and the Islamic tradition aren't entirely frowning upon war and conflict. There is a concept of justified war, right? There is a concept of purposeful, even offensive jihad, right? It's something that's very measured, very carefully considered. There are a lot of rules around it. There's a lot of limitations on when and how it can be implemented, etc. Right? But it's not to deny that that does not happen. There is sort of this element of empire building, right, of expanding the borders of the Muslim state, etc. And the reason I mention that is because you will find these things when you read about Islamic history, about empires spreading and conflicts happening and all of these things. But that should not be confused with the spread of Islam, because when you think about the spread of Islam, what you are thinking about most likely is forced conversion or voluntary conversion, but some form of conversion to Islam. And there's a difference between the spread of the empire and the spread of people's acceptance or widespread acceptance of the religion. What Hugh Kennedy is saying is that Islam did not spread by the sword, but without the sword, it could not have spread, because obviously it's a historical reality that, as the Muslim empire spread, there was a facilitation. There were more opportunities for more people to be exposed to the message of Islam, as well as for more interaction for Muslims. Right. So Hugh Kennedy is not a Muslim scholar. He's a very renowned historian, and in agreement with many other renowned historians, he is saying these words that Islam did not spread by the sword. When you say Islam spread by the sword, there's a very particular imagery, a very particular meaning that is being conveyed there, which is historically inaccurate. But without the sword, it could not have spread. So the sword or conflict would be a better term, has facilitated indirectly more engagement of Muslims with non-Muslims, which ultimately led to the spread of Islam. And this is not something unique to the spread of other ideas and ideologies and even objects, the spread of food to different regions of the world, right? The spread of clothing styles and everything has been facilitated by this pre-modern reality of empire building, which nearly any kind of ideology or group of people engaged with.
Can I just mention another historian? Kennedy, by the way, is a British historian based in London. I just thought I'd mention that. In your article, you mentioned the myth of fanatical Muslims sweeping through the world and forcing Islam at the point of the sword on everyone as one of the most absurd myths that have ever been repeated. And you referred to the renowned historian from the University of Chicago in the United States, Professor Marshall Hodgson. Now, he is the author of this celebrated text entitled The Venture of Islam, Conscience and History in a World Civilization. Now, this is one of the standard texts at university. Professor Jonathan Brown first brought this to our attention in a video as a recommended reading. The author is not a Muslim. He's a Christian, I think, and one of the most celebrated historians of Islamic history. And you reference this book in your article, page 199. I just wanted to read just a few highlighted words, I was going to say verses, words, which are very germane to your comments just now. And so Professor Marshall Hodgson writes, there was no attempt, he said, at converting the peoples of the imperial territories, in other words, of the empire, the Muslim empire, who practically all adhered to some form of confessional religion already. In other words, they were Christians or Jews or Zoroastrians or whatever they were. Islam was felt to be primarily, if not exclusively, meant for Arabs. And only within the peninsula, that's the Arab peninsula, was there any sense that all ought to be Muslims. Yet even Christian Arab tribes were still allowed to participate actively in the conquests. In the chiefly non-Arab agricultural lands, the object was not the conversion, but the rule of those lands. The limited example of Muhammad is subjecting settled Jews and Christians in Western Arabia was extended beyond Arabia to all lands within reach. The superiority of Islam as religion, and therefore in providing social order, would justify Muslim rule, would justify the simple, fair-dealing Muslims in replacing the privileged and oppressive representatives of the older, corrupted allegiances. End quote. It's a bit more there than just about no forced conversions, but the sense of that Islam brought a new social order based on justice rather than the old one of corruption and oppression. So there's a real sense of wars of liberation almost in that narrative as well. Now, I do recommend that book if you want a top scholarly work on this subject by a leading historian. Sorry, just wanted to share that information.
Absolutely, and I completely endorse as well from my standpoint. The work of Marshall Hodgson is great for understanding all of these things. Again, without sort of minimizing any particular perspective or aspect of the history, and just pointing out that history is complicated. Right, history is complicated, and that's sort of the gist of the article that I wrote, and many of the historical focused sort of conversations that I have. Now, all of that being said, how does Islam spread historically? Right. So that is, as we mentioned, there is an empire being built, and there is more engagement happening. And so in the second part, I just want to make reference to this. In the second part of this series of articles on Yaqeen Institute's website, the second article is titled very simply, How Islam Spread Throughout the World. And within that, I outline many, many examples of how trade, migration, intermarriage, social influence, as well as factors such as the appeal of Islam's emphasis on justice and unity and universality, all under the umbrella of this concept of da'wah, of this concept of invitation to non-Muslims, as well as to Muslims to engage or re-engage with the message of Islam, are some of the factors that we can use as categories when we think about, how has Islam spread to different regions of the world. And so there are a lot of references there. There are a lot of stories there. And, I encourage people to study, locally within their own regions where they live, how Islam has actually spread, how Muslims first arrived in those regions, and how Islam has spread gradually. Depending on, again, like where you are, right? Because the factors, some may have played a role more than others, but the point I started with is to realize that this is a complex process. It is a world transformational process, and we cannot take these such processes that have occurred in human history and sort of summarize them in a way that erases so much of their reality and then weaponize them. And we have to be very careful about doing that. Whether it's in our, for our purposes, that narrative that we result with seems to be for our benefit or not, right? So hopefully that element is clear, because of course I feel like we should and we will go on as well to discuss, some examples of forced conversion in Islamic history, because we are not denying that that has also happened, right? That is certainly part of the picture, and is certainly a part of the picture that we have to pay attention to and see, okay, how do we understand this? How do we understand these real events in Islamic history, even if what happened was in violation of the very clear message of the Quran, which, as we said, says, let there be no compulsion in religion, right? But in Islamic history, of course, the behavior of Muslims will not always conform to the teachings of Islam. How do we understand this? So we can discuss some of those examples, as well as some factors, I believe, such as the jizya and the concept of the zimma or the zimmi people, etc. So I think those will clarify further the sort of kind of background we've set here.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Those, what is jizya and the dhimmi status are really important, particularly in the West. These are real triggering terms almost, and to clarify what they really mean will be very helpful. Thank you.
Certainly. So the jizya can be translated as tribute or poll tax, and it is derived from the Arabic word al-jaza, which basically refers to compensation. And basically what the jizya is one of the options that was offered to non-Muslim communities and individuals, in which they could pay a tax in return for protection within the Muslim empire, right? And that's a very summarized way of saying it. There's just a few different points about that, just to paint a more fuller picture. The first thing is, what were the other options, right? So if jizya is one of the options that was offered, what are the others? It's usually assumed that the options were you either pay the jizya. I do apologize. There's something in my throat. You either pay the jizya, or you convert to Islam, or you will be killed. That's often the assumption. But in practice, and this is documented in another article on the Yaqeen Institute website, which I will refer to sort of by name, and hopefully we can add that to the description as well, just to make it easier for people to access. But more often, the options actually were in replacement of death was actually exile, right? So if Muslims have come to the position where they are negotiating a peace agreement. First of all, not all of the Aman agreements, as they're known as peace agreements, not all of them followed this basic formulation, but this formulation was often used, such as, you either pay this tax as a community with certain conditions, which we'll talk about in a moment, or you can, of course, convert to Islam and become part of the Muslim community, in which case you are exempt from the tax, although you do have to pay other taxes, such as the zakat, right, and sadaqah, and there's a very complex sort of formulation there as well. And oftentimes the zakat is interesting because it was compulsory on more people, and oftentimes the rate which you were paying was actually higher. So when we talk about, okay, well, maybe the jizya was just designed to pressure people from a financial standpoint to convert to Islam. In many cases, that actually would not be the historical reality. They would not have an easier time by converting to Islam and removing the jizya requirement, because they still were required to pay the zakat, right? And then other sort of taxes that became part of the early Muslim system of administration. So you have that, and you have the exile option, in which case you do not want to pay the jizya, or you do not want to convert to Islam. You are free to go. You can migrate to other places, etc. So that was another option that was given. Another element of jizya to keep in mind is that, like I said, the zakat was applicable to more people. So the jizya was designed in a way to provide protection, or I should say defined in a way to provide protection to adult males, that the Muslim empire will protect you from external threats in exchange for you paying this tax, but only for adult males. So women and children and even monks, so people who were involved in scholarly work, were actually exempt. The other thing that is interesting about the jizya is there actually is no fixed amount. It did vary from situation to situation, from empire to empire, etc. And there is a lot of commentary from Islamic scholars from the very beginning about making it as easy as possible. So flexibility in terms of the payment, as well as many other forms of leniency, different rates for people who are not able to afford what may be set, within a locality as the standard rate, et cetera, et cetera. So again, when you dig into the details, you get a more comprehensive picture of what this might have actually looked like. If we just try to keep it simple and say there was a tax imposed on non-Muslims, of course, that sounds, okay, very unfair, very discriminatory, very sort of designed to compel these individuals to convert to Islam, a form of force, which is this concept of zimmitude that is often discussed by some scholars, but which has sort of been challenged and criticized by many other historians, saying that this is not actually, a good representation of what we see in the historical sources. The jizya was very lenient, often more lenient than the taxes that the different communities were paying to the empires that preceded the Muslims. So in some senses, often it was a form of relief almost for these communities that were being ruled. And that's essentially what the jizya was. And we can talk about how that relates to the zimmitude, which basically means, the zimma, that responsibility or protection, the responsibility of protection is now upon the Muslim community, the Muslim empire, to protect these, communities of other faith backgrounds against all external threats, etc. Right, and all internal threats as well. So protecting them even from, persecution from Muslims, etc. So there have been these examples in history where a certain, for example, a Muslim ruler who is rebelling against the central Muslim authority decides to basically, emphasize his power by persecuting non-Muslims, and the Central Muslim Authority actually has to send a force to actually defend the non-Muslims from this Muslim rebellious ruler, etc. So there are examples along those lines as well. That is, I think, an apt sort of introduction overall to different aspects of this.
Thank you. Can I just introduce a subject which you mentioned on page 7 of your article, Did Islam Spread by the Sword? You referred to the famous treaty between the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the second Muslim caliph, who died in 644. So this is the early 7th century, really, really early. And you say this gives us an example of the Dhimma agreement, in which forced conversions were explicitly forbidden. I just want to read what this actually said. And you're actually quoting from Professor Hugh Kennedy, this British historian, again, from his book, The Great Arab Conquest, How the Spread of Islam Changed the World We Live In, from 2007. And he writes, he quotes from this famous treaty, which goes as follows, in part anyway. This is the assurance of safety which the servant of God, Umar, the commander of the faithful, that's what the caliphs were called then, has given to the people of Jerusalem. He has given them an assurance of safety for themselves, for their property, their churches, their crosses, the sick and healthy of the city, and for all the rituals which belong to their religion. Their churches will not be inhabited by the Muslims and will not be destroyed. Neither they nor the land on which they stand, nor their crosses, not their property, will be damaged. They will not be forcibly converted. They will not be forcibly converted. So says the famous treaty between Sophronius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the second Muslim caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, who died in 644. That's fascinating.
Absolutely. And that was a precedent-setting agreement. And in many other cases in Islamic history, when you find this kind of negotiation happening between Muslims and non-Muslims for a peace agreement in newly conquered areas, that wording is very familiar. So when you read about it in different situations, such as in Spain in the early 8th century, if you have read the Pact of Umar, you immediately sense that ring of familiarity that I have heard this kind of wording before. So it was a very impactful document, and even to this day really informs much of the conversation about how Muslims, when they are in positions of influence, are to engage with sort of non-Muslim minorities.
Oh, fascinating. Now, can you give examples of the peaceful spread of Islam? It's slightly tangential here, because in most of the world, of course, Islam had nothing to do with empires. I mean, I'm thinking of places like Southeast Asia and West Africa, where how was Islam spread there if it wasn't through the acquisition of territory by any empire?
Very much through trade, right? So I mentioned some of the factors earlier. I do believe in my research that trade has been, enormously impactful in this history, particularly because, just from our own experiences, and this has been the case throughout history, when you are having a transaction with an individual that you believe is for your own benefit, you might leave a lot of your baggage at the door, right? And come to the table with a more open mind. You might not engage with another individual for any other purpose. You might not be interested because they are of a different faith or something, although, that is something I would say we should frown upon. But it's a reality for certain people that they just want to keep to themselves and, to their own particular way of life, and not engage at all with people who have like a different sort of background or approach. But that being said, when it comes to trade, when you feel like you're doing something for your own benefit, you might be able to make a little bit of a compromise on that, no matter how much you might not compromise in any other aspect of life. So that being said, in West Africa, for example, when we talk about sub-Saharan West Africa, or even West Africa, Central Africa, that region as a whole, the trans-Saharan trade, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence about the spread of Islam within that region through trade, right? Through this exposure to people who were Muslim, exposure of non-Muslims to people who were, Muslim. And similarly with Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, it's also very interesting in the sense of the migration, right? So migration is another one of the factors that I mentioned, and that's both forced as well as voluntary migration. So forced migration, for those of us who are in the Americas, in North America, we know that many of the Black peoples, the African peoples who were enslaved in the transatlantic slave trade and brought to the Americas, they carried with them this embodied knowledge of Islam, and they were the first Muslims in the Americas, and it became part of the cultural, sort of roots of the African Americans and the Afro-Brazilians and other communities, which ultimately over time, through a very long process, gave us individuals like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, et cetera, coming full circle in a sense and returning to Islam.
Can I just say about that? It's sure. A really important point here for us in the West, particularly, us Europeans. We think of, Muslims in America, recent immigration, we think of Muhammad Ali and so on. But what you're saying is that Muslims were in America, or even perhaps before the revolution, in large numbers as slaves brought from Africa, basically. But they were there in their millions. So Muslims were in North America from the very beginning. These weren't recent immigrants from, the middle of the 20th century. So that they're historically a part of this activity in North America from the beginning, when there were white Christians, there were Black Muslims, and they were all in the coexisting in various unjust ways, of course. But the Muslims were there from the very beginning, and they weren't recent immigrants. So the idea of America being a white Christian country, which is the popular, perhaps, understanding in many circles in the United States, is simply not true. And we're not dealing here with just a few Muslims. We're dealing here with a very large number of Muslims who are brought to the United States, often have to practice their faith in secret, who are suppressed, of course, by the Christian overlords, weren't allowed to practice their faith freely. So this is a paradigm shifting moment, really, for those who are not aware of what you're speaking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And really in any part of the world, right, it's that whole concept of this being a recent phenomenon it's like that kind of joke about, if you only read half the newspaper, it doesn't mean the rest of the news didn't happen. It did happen, but you only read half the newspaper, right? So just because we might not choose to make ourselves aware of a longer history does not mean that the history itself is not there. So, for example, I think within Europe itself, there's a good example of Hungary. Like the region of Hungary today, and all of the rhetoric you hear from the far right sort of establishments, et cetera, about refugees and Muslims and brown-skinned people, and how we have to save the essence of Europe and all these kinds of things. But Muslims were present in Hungary, and there's so much evidence of this. And again, in my second article for Yaqeen Institute, How Islam Spread by the Sword, I actually have a very long list of references, as well as, of course, summaries of the research that's being done as well. But these are, now 900-year-old events that we're talking about, like a Muslim presence and Muslims present and in influential positions in the region that is now Hungary, right? So in almost every region, we looked at the example of a specific city, even Christchurch, New Zealand, right? And almost every region and almost every place, Muslims have been sort of present, and there's a much longer history. And just to quickly wrap up the point about Southeast Asia, in that particular region, scholars, especially one particular group of traveling scholars known as the Ba'alawi, scholars from the region of Yemen, traveled to Southeast Asia and settled within that region, and they taught the religion of Islam, and that was sort of the initial driving force, as well as, again, trade, right? Very, very far-reaching trade, and again, so many examples of just how far-reaching it was, especially around, historically, the Indian Ocean by some historians is referred to as a Muslim lake, because it came to be surrounded by these predominantly Muslim societies, but the ocean itself and the Muslims' heavy involvement in trade was a conduit for the particular movement, not just of goods that were being traded, but people moving along with the goods, as well as ideas moving along with the goods, including ideas about Islam, and of course the character of the Muslims, and the unique qualities of the Muslims that the people they were engaging with in all different parts of the world were observing and perhaps being impressed by.
Well, wasn't there a Chinese admiral who very early on was enthusiastically was a Muslim, and built lots of mosques around that part of the world? Do you know anything about him?
Yeah, so that's Admiral Cheng Ho, and he was he was Muslim, and he served the Ming Dynasty, and he has these famous 7 voyages in the 13th century, the 14th century, in which he sailed into different regions of the Indian Ocean coastlines, basically on behalf of the Ming Dynasty as a diplomat, as well as a merchant, as well as a Muslim. So there's a debate about whether he actually took the opportunity in one of the journeys to perform the Hajj personally, but certainly there were other Muslims with him on these voyages, and they performed the Hajj, in the course of one of these voyages. He was very influential in Southeast Asia. If you go even today, many places will be named after him. Many historic mosques will be named after him within that region. So this is, again, when we talk about the factors that I outlined, I mentioned them all earlier, right? Social influence is one of those factors in which people use their personal and their social kind of influence and their positions in society to make a certain kind of impression, or to basically create space for certain conversations and to deliver a certain message, which may otherwise have not been delivered or would have to be delivered in different ways. So Cheng Ho is certainly an example of that, and there are many others.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite examples is in England. In the 8th century, there was an Anglo-Saxon king of England called Offa, Offa. And some of his coins, the official coins of the English king of England, gold coins, had, guess what, the Shahada on them. They're in Arabic. So, I bear witness there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is a prophet of God. It actually was on English coinage in the 8th century AD. An English king had this. Why? Well, he wasn't a Muslim himself. I know some people say, I don't think he was a Muslim. But coming back to the trade thing, it's a question of, the emerging Muslim world. And it was really quite expedient to have coinage that was perhaps utilizable in the wider Muslim world. But he had no problem with putting the Shahada on his own coins. And it's hard to think that today the British coins would have the Shahada on them, but in the 8th century, they did.
Right. So many other examples. I mean, we could prolong this episode by a lot if we were to go into all of them. So
don't worry, folks.
Hopefully, and this is why I tell people, first of all, I encourage you to read the article, the second article on Yaqeen Institute, which will be linked in the description. As well, I believe. And the other thing is look into your local history. Like you just told me something about the UK, right? If we look at any region in the world, if you are grappling with this question of did Islam spread by the sword or was it primarily through forced conversions, look into the history of where you lived first. How did Islam actually spread in that region? Who were the people involved, et cetera, and see if these descriptions of Islam spread through forced conversion or spread by the sword, et cetera, how much of that history are they actually, representing truthfully, right? And in most cases, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not in every case, so we will talk about that as well, right? But in most cases, you will find that it was a complex process, and force or coercion or pressure had very little to do with it.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned briefly, we ought to cover this. Can you give examples of forced conversions of people to Islam? Because it did happen, even though it was exceptional. And the thought-provoking details that remind us that historical events are rarely as simple as we too easily believe.
Certainly. So first of all, I appreciate that we're having this conversation because, just because Muslims are unfairly treated and unfairly represented, or I should say they're misrepresented in a lot of historical discourse. Sometimes our reaction to that is to minimize or actually, just to outright deny that some of these, things have happened in Islamic history that are probably not very enjoyable or something we'd like to promote as Muslims today, right? They don't really inspire us particularly, these things, these events, right? Dislikable sort of aspects of Islamic history. And there are many of them. And Islamic history is the collective experience of Muslims, right? At least that's in a very loose sense. That's how I like to see it. And so it's important to acknowledge basically all of these things, to understand them before conversations continue in which you are not able to situate your understanding, right? So which happens in the media, which happens in a lot of other spaces, where if you don't do the legwork and know, a different perspective on how to understand these historical events, there will be that shock value when you see someone else discussing them from a different standpoint, and perhaps weaponizing them against Muslims today. So two examples that I shared in the paper, or I actually shared more than two, but I'll focus on these two for now. The first is the Devshirme system in the Ottoman Empire. And essentially what this system was, it produced a special force known as the Janissaries, which you will come across very quickly if you read Ottoman history. And these were young boys, essentially, who were taken from their families in a systematic way. So not just rounded up and taken, but like boys of a certain age, and a sort of system of circulating among villages, and every 10th boy, and the system fluctuated over time. But the point is, there was a system. It wasn't just the whims of a particular individual, etc. And these boys, nevertheless, they are taken from their families, which were usually Christian families in the Balkans, and they were then raised as Muslims. So essentially, converted to Islam by force, of course, because their parents obviously were not involved in the process, or people who could rightfully be considered their guardians were not involved in that decision for them. And the children themselves were often too young to be making such a decision for themselves as well. So they are now raised as Muslims to be part of the Janissary force, which was essentially the Ottoman Sultan's personal guard. And they were raised in this way, so again, I've described it up to a point so far, but now I'm about to say they are raised in this way because, right? And this is the point that we are trying to make here, not denying that it was a horrific process. It was a disruptive process for families and communities that, and there was a lot that was, in violation of perhaps Islamic teachings there, as well as, we would all be sort of morally offended if we were to see this happen, right? Not denying any of that, or sort of the gravity of this, but the context is always important to understand why something happened, how it happened, right? And if we in our own time were to take some lesson from that situation to see, how we would behave differently or make decisions differently, it would be important for us to know all of those relevant details. So now I'm going to say the purpose of this system was to have a personal guard for the Ottoman Sultan that was that could be more relied upon to be loyal to the Ottoman Sultan than perhaps the Turkish core of the Ottoman army, which had other sort of networks of relationships within that society that might, prove to be unreliable. Certain segments of that army might be proved to be unreliable for the Ottoman Sultan in sort of fluctuating political context, etc. But because these individuals were raised, for a very, very particular purpose and very rigorously trained, they could be expected to be more reliable. So that is the whole purpose of the system. The system, in a way, effectively became a social ladder for many of the individuals, the young Christian boys who were put through it. So they're raised as Muslims, and many of them, they reach sort of positions of influence within society, right? And because they are the Sultan's personal guard, they're often able to use their position, so they don't end up being as reliable as perhaps the Sultan had hoped in some cases, right? So they're able to use their own influence to basically act in their own interests, as well as in the interests of the non-Muslim communities in the Balkans, from which they were recalled, of course, that they had originated from, right? And so there are specific examples of this, of a particular person put through the Devshirme system and becoming an influential person within the Ottoman sort of government, and then using that position of influence to benefit their family who remain sort of non-Muslim, as well as the community in which they originated, and provide a measure of protection, etc. All of which is to say, very, in a lot of words, it is complicated, right? It is a complex process, and it did occur over several centuries, and there were different criteria in the reigns of different Ottoman sultans. And so to properly understand this, not to obfuscate the fact that, this is something that is deplorable, in my opinion, although, as historians, we try not to go too far in terms of making value judgments about history, right? So we know that our context is sort of limited, our knowledge of the context, right? And history is complicated again, but it is to say that we need to dig a little bit deeper and understand this. The other example I want to share is the Orphans Decree in Yemen, which is a decree that was passed by the ruler. So this one is more specific. It was passed by a ruler known as Imam Yahya after the First World War. So this is more recent as well. And basically, it was a decree to convert Jewish children to Islam, right? And again, if you read the wording of the decree, right, of the actual document that was prepared to kind of give these instructions to the different administrative units in Yemen, etc., if you only read that and don't read the context that comes with the text, if you read the text only, you would be convinced that this is clearly a case of, deplorable, horrific forced conversion, right? But I apologize. But when you actually look into the context of Imam Yahya himself, the person who issued this decree, and all of the different factors at play. So after issuing the decree, and there was a very political purpose for which he was issuing the decree, it was a way that he figured that he would exert his authority in a sort of overall colonial context, and establishing his position vis-a-vis the British and all of these other, geopolitical factors that are at play. He puts this decree in place, and he himself is violating his own rules and actually helping Jewish children escape the kind of persecution that he has sort of, in theory, mandated in writing, right? And providing all kinds of leniency, and there's all kinds of, loopholes and gaps in the implementation, etc. To the point that despite all of this being known about Imam Yahya, to this day, even, he's still very favorably seen by the Jewish community, right? Despite being aware of this, because they know the text and they know this sort of, how kind of dislikable the language and the message of the text is, but they also know the reality, right, of what actually happened historically. So the orphans decree in Yemen is this moment of forced conversion, certainly, and certainly, there was forced conversion in some cases of these Jewish children. But there is a larger story, right? And all we are asking, all the purpose of my article was to say, let's look at the bigger picture. Let's be serious. Let's not be disingenuous about this. Let's not just weaponize very generalized historical narratives for whichever purpose that we would like, but let's actually try to get a more realistic, more holistic look at the history, which is always complicated.
Thank you. Well, what I find interesting is, just very briefly touching on the other Abrahamic faiths, Judaism and Christianity. Islam, as far as I'm aware, is the only one of the three that has an explicit scriptural injunction, which you've already read out: let there be no compulsion in religion. 2:5:6. There's no such comparable text that I'm aware of in the Jewish Bible or the Christian New Testament. That's not to say, by the way, that the Catholic Church approves of compulsion, for example. That's not the case, far from it. But in terms of the actual scriptures themselves, I think Islam is the only one to actually have this clear injunction that forced conversion is completely ruled out. And that's very, very interesting. And you see this played out historically, whether there are exceptions, as you described, or even though they are complicated and have various dimensions which at first sight might not be apparent. It seems to be honored, this injunction, far more in the honor than in the breach. In other words, it was the norm rather than the exception. Other religions, it wasn't the case. It was more the exception rather than the rule, until the modern era, when Christianity now is much more liberal and much more tolerant and accepting. But historically, it wasn't so. It was actually the other way around. But anyway, this is not a program about those other religions. In conclusion, Hassam, is there anything you'd just like to mention about this extraordinary subject?
I kind of gave my conclusion there, just at the end of what I said in my last when I was speaking. But again, just to reiterate, let's be people who appreciate the complexity and appreciate just sort of all the factors at play in the human experience, right? And Islamic history is part of the collective human experience. So the reason I phrase it that way is because, as much as I ask that due consideration be given when we are looking at Islamic history, that should go for history of all groups and all sort of traditions and everything. Let's duly appreciate the complexity. It's my personal belief that human beings, and it's sort of related to the concept of the fitrah in Islam as well, the natural predisposition of the human being. But I will say that it's my personal belief that, based on all of the history I have read, the vast, overwhelming majority of people just want to live a good life, peacefully coexisting with their neighbors and the people they live around with, irrespective of the differences, right? So when we do see things, in quotations, go wrong in human history, right? For lack of a better way to phrase it, when we do things, when we see things that are clearly like that is an exception to that overall kind of goodness of the collective human experience, it's important to study them in detail and not sort of get caught up in the immediate emotions. And even the emotions are coming from a good place. If you see something that is morally offensive and you have a strong reaction to it, I don't necessarily consider that as a sort of a weakness or anything like that. But we do have to stay measured in those moments and say, okay, we're going to step back and get a due appreciation for this situation, learn everything there is to learn about it, and see what kind of conclusions would actually be, moving us towards that peaceful coexistence once again. So that's sort of the lesson in it for me.
Perfect. Well, that's a beautiful summary. Thank you so much. And once again, I do recommend you read this article, Did Islam Spread by the Sword? A critical look at forced conversions. I'll link to it in the description below, along with the other article Hassam mentioned as well. So absolutely fascinating and a really important subject. Hopefully we'll dispel misconceptions for people if they weren't aware of the actual history of Islam in the world, rather than, as you mentioned, Twitter sound bites or whatever it is that is spreading this false news these days. So thank you so much indeed, Hassam, and thank you for your valuable time as well.
Thank you very much.
Till next time.